When he looks at Walter Jr., he remembers seeing him in a picture in Walter's wallet, and he figures that he's looking at the son of Heisenberg right now. Hey everybody, and thank you for watching another video. My name is Merge, and welcome to the Breaking Bad What If series that I call the Heisenverse, a series where I make a change somewhere in the Breaking Bad or Better Call Saul timeline and see how that one change ripples out the entire universe. And in this video, we're going to explore the famous lost episode of Breaking Bad that was ultimately cut from the series, and although the script may or may not still be out there, with the help of an old Reddit post and a couple of interviews, I'm here to bring the episode to life. And also, full disclaimer, this story is going to get pretty dark, so you've been warned. And before we get started, if you could leave a like on this video to support the channel, I'd appreciate it. Now, let's get into it. Walter and Jesse nervously get into the car before driving away from the junkyard, and as Tuco watches them leave, he begins to think to himself if he can actually trust his newest associates, and decides to put some feelers out to learn more about them. A couple days pass, and Walter meets up with Jesse to talk about what they should do. And between Walter seeing Tuco's black Cadillac parked down the street from his house, and Jesse spotting it riding through his neighborhood as well, they start to worry for their own safety, thinking that they could be next. And when Jesse pulls out his recently purchased gun, when slamming it on the countertop, no words would need to be spoken to know what he means by this gesture. And at first, Walter is against this plan, having never handled a gun before, let alone fired one. And when working out the logistics on how they'll even do it, there's not many scenarios that end with them surviving a shootout with Tuco, especially when they can't even open the chamber of the gun. So instead, Walter goes with a more discreet approach and decides to use ricin to poison them. And after cooking it up in Jesse's basement, they start to work on their pitch on how they're going to give it to him.
It's a new meth formula we've been working on. Would you care to try it?
Okay, well, what's new about it?
But when Walter receives a phone call from Hank, who sends him a photo of a crime scene, he's left in shock when he sees Gonzo dead at the junkyard right along with Nodos. And they both go into panic mode as Walter gets the gun from Jesse and he tells him to just get out of town, because if Tuco's killing his own guys, it's only a matter of time before he comes after them. And Walter leaves to check on his family as Jesse scrambles around for his things. But just outside, parked a few houses down, will be Tuco sitting in a beater car looking to be watching Jesse's home. And after seeing Walter leave, he ducks down in the seat in order for him not to be seen, and once the coast was clear, Tuco decides to pay Jesse a visit. Because he just nearly evaded the DEA, and he knows with the heat on him that he has to get across the border to lay low. But he's not going to leave without his favorite cook. And being that he can't just walk up to Walter's door and ask him to come to Mexico, he's just gonna get his mule boy to do it. So as Tuco walks up and knocks on the door, Jesse would assume that it's Walter who forgot something and doesn't even check to see who it is, which will be his biggest mistake because Tuco just forces his way inside. And without a gun, Jesse grabs a nearby bat telling him to get out. But when Tuco brandishes a gun, Jesse lowers the bat and says defensively, "Hey yo, I promise I didn't say anything to anybody, but if you want the money, you can have it back." And Tuco says with a half smile, "I don't need your money, but I do need your ride." And as Jesse slowly goes into his pocket to get his keys to offer to him, Tuco tells him, "You're driving." And Jesse, being in no position to refuse, just slowly walks out the house with Tuco following behind him. And together they take a drive over to 308 Negra Arroyo Lane. Over at Walter's house, after pulling into the driveway, he slowly enters holding the gun. And when he calls out for Walter Jr. and Skyler and gets no answer, it would make him assume the worst. But when he opens up the bathroom door and sees Skyler taking a bubble bath, he's relieved to see that she's safe. And after asking about Walter Jr., he's able to breathe a sigh of relief when she tells him that he's out having dinner at Lewis's house. And knowing that his family is safe, he can actually relax for a second. But with the gun still in his hand, he's reminded of the danger that he's in, and he quickly goes over to Holly's nursery to get his money. But by him abruptly leaving Skyler in the middle of her talking, she yells for him to come back. But Walter ignores her while packing his money into a diaper box, and before he's able to put the gun inside, Skyler's yelling forces him to return back to her, and he just keeps the gun in his pocket for now. And while sitting at the edge of the tub, Skyler just wants him to talk to her, and right when it seems that he's about to come clean to her, his phone rings, but he just pulls it out to ignore the call, and before he can get another word out, he sees flashing car lights poking through his curtains. And already paranoid of an attack from Tuco, Walter gets up to see who's in front of his house. But when he pulls back the curtains and sees Jesse in his driveway, he gets annoyed and goes outside to see what he wants. But as he approaches the car demanding answers from Jesse, he would see Tuco emerge from the backseat with a gun and telling him to get in. And just like Jesse before him, with no other choice, Walter looks around before he slowly gets into the car. And as they drive away from his home, Walter feels the gun that's still in his jacket pocket, and he would discreetly take it from his pocket and put it into his sock. And when they get a couple miles down the road, Tuco would take their phones before putting them in the trunk and driving for hours to an unknown location. And after a while, the heat would cause them to pass out in the trunk, only to be awakened by the blinding sunlight when they're pulled out by Tuco, who's aiming an M16 rifle at them. And while Walter is begging for his life, telling Tuco that he doesn't have to do this, Jesse's already accepted that he's probably gonna die out here. And although he's just as terrified as Walter is, it's not that difficult to know who he really wants. And if that's the case, he doesn't want to delay the inevitable by going into this little house just to die. And he tells Tuco, "Hey yo, if you're gonna kill us, just get it over with, yo." And as Walter tries to speak for Jesse, saying, No, Tuco, he didn't mean that." But as Tuco closes the trunk, he walks right up to Jesse without breaking eye contact with him. And like a switch has been flipped on inside his head, out of nowhere, Tuco would go on the attack and he knees Jesse right in the groin, having him fall on the ground. He then picks him up by the neck and pins him against a nearby wall. And as Walter tries to de-escalate the situation, Tuco shuts him up by aiming a rifle at him while he continues to beat Jesse until he finds himself on his hands and knees right in front of a nearby ditch, begging for his life. And while Tuco holds the rifle to the back of his head, he would call Walter over to his side while he pulls out a pistol from his waistline. And while pointing the pistol at Walter's head, he would hand him the rifle that's still pointed at Jesse. And Tuco gives Walter an order saying, "Okay, Heisenberg, now shoot him." "Tuco, please, no, I can't, please." Walter says trying to refuse the rifle, but Tuco forces it in his hands, and while standing right behind Walter with the gun to his head, he tells him, "Either you're gonna shoot him, or I'm gonna shoot you, then I'm gonna shoot him. Now do it!" And even with the gun to the back of his head, he finds it hard to pull the trigger on his former student, especially hearing Jesse from the ground crying that he doesn't want to die. And after a few seconds pass, and Walter still hasn't pulled the trigger, Tuco gives him a little motivation by starting a countdown. 5, 4, and Walter's hands begin to sweat as he feels the cold steel against his scalp pressing harder and harder with each number. 3, 2, Tuco says, pulling the hammer back on the gun, and Jesse would tightly close his eyes as the tears fall into the sand, and he yells, "Mr. White, just do it!" And before Tuco gets to 1, Walter says with watery eyes, "I'm sorry, Jesse." And he fires a single shot to the back of Jesse's head, killing him instantly. And as his body slumps over halfway into the ditch, Tuco would take the gun away from Walter, who right now is on the verge of breaking down, having just committed cold-blooded murder of his own partner. But Tuco snaps him out of it when he kicks Jesse's body all the way into the ditch before telling him, "Come inside, Heisenberg. Don't want you going belly up on me no time soon." And as they go inside the house, Tuco leaves Walter standing in the doorway while he goes into the kitchen. And as Walter takes a look around the tiny rundown home, he sees an older man who's in a wheelchair with a bell attached to it. And before he's allowed to even take a seat, Tuco comes from the kitchen with a gallon of water and sets it on the table, but he wouldn't be allowed to take a sip until Tuco does his lie detector on him. And after a solid 10 minutes of eye contact, Tuco puts his head against Walter's, now believing that he can trust him, and he pushes him down on the couch to allow him to take a drink. And as Tuco walks around to comfort his grandfather, he sits across from Walter and lets him know that his place just so happened to get raided by the DEA only a day after what happened with Nodos, which he defends wasn't even his fault that his own man didn't know his place. And after going on a meth-fueled rant about not trusting the people you love, Walter simply listens, trying not to upset Tuco, but in his mind, all he can think about is Jesse as he slowly gets consumed by guilt. But when Tuco tells him his plan of going to Mexico to cook, Walter would then speak up, telling him that he can't just leave because he has a family. But that doesn't matter to Tuco, as he responds saying,
You'll get another one.
And being too scared to speak out against him, Walter just nods while his eyes follow Tuco around. But deep down inside, an ember of anger will begin to ignite within him. Not only for Jesse, who Tuco hasn't even acknowledged at this point, but also because Tuco just looks at him as nothing more than someone who can cook meth for him. Not a person, or even a friend, but just a slave. So after Tuco takes another bump of the blue meth, he heads back into the kitchen to start cooking, and leaving Walter in the company of his Theo Hector. But as he sits on the couch listening to the Spanish program in the background, Walter nervously begins to shake his leg. And feeling the extra weight around his sock, he realizes that the gun is still on him. And while Tuco continues to cook, Walter begins to think of the original plan of using the ricin. But after what he was forced to do to Jesse, a more sinister idea comes to mind. And after a couple minutes, when Walter's called over to the table to eat, Tuco walks over to his Uncle Hector to take the brakes off the wheelchair to bring him over to the table as well. And while his attention is focused on the Spanish program, Walter would quickly reach into his sock to grab the gun, and Hector would see the entire thing. But before he can even ring the bell once, Walter fires. But the shot would accidentally hit Hector right in the throat and causing him to slump over in his wheelchair and choke on his own blood. And Tuco would only have a fraction of a second to react. But in that time, Walter would get another shot off, hitting him in the side and having him fall to the ground to clutch at his wound. And Walter's able to get up from the table and knock Tuco out with the butt of the gun. And with his adrenaline pumping, he knows that he's on the clock because the cousins will be here soon. So after finding some tape nearby, he binds Tuco's arms and legs before dragging him out to Jesse's car and putting him in the trunk. And as he drives away, he looks back in the rearview mirror where Jesse was killed and is saddened that he was forced to leave his body behind. but he makes a promise that he will avenge his death because he has plans in store for Tuco Salamanca, and he drives off in the red Captain Cook lowrider. But only after a few minutes, Hank Schrader would arrive in the area and will be left with his own set of questions when seeing both Jesse and Hector dead at the scene, with the biggest question being, who exactly was Jesse Pinkman? Later on that night, after hours of driving, Walter finally makes it home still behind the wheel of Jesse's lowrider, and he circles the house looking through the windows to see if anyone's home, and luckily, the house is empty. And Walter nervously opens the trunk with his gun in hand, afraid that Tuco might lunge at him. But when he sees that Tuco's still passed out, likely due to the blood loss that he suffered, Walter pulls him out the trunk and quickly drags him into the house. And once inside, he puts even more duct tape around Tuco, starting with his hands and completely binding his fingers and his legs, making sure there's no wiggle room for him to get out. And finally putting a gag over his mouth and even tending to the gunshot to make sure that he doesn't die anytime soon. And after Tuco was all wrapped up, Walter would simply drop him down into the crawl space and throws a blanket down to cover his body. And after closing and locking the door, Walter gets back into the lowrider and drives it over to Jesse's house. And in the middle of wiping down his prints from the car, he notices Jesse's rainy day fund sitting in the passenger seat, and it leaves him conflicted about taking it, but he's not just gonna leave it here. And besides, they were 50-50 partners, so as much as it eats at his consciousness, Walter would take the bag of money and start walking home. And while working on his alibi, instead of him coming up with a fugue state story, he would actually tell them the same thing that he told the therapist while he was in a doctor's office.
My wife is 7 months pregnant with a baby we didn't intend. My 15-year-old son has cerebral palsy, and within 18 months, I will be dead.
Which, yeah, if you're Skyler or Walter Jr., you might feel some kind of way, but I'm sure over time you might understand where he was coming from. So after one of the most uncomfortable confessions he ever had to make to his family, Walter sleeps in the nursery across from the crawl space until Skyler lets him back in the room. But with Tuco squirming around under his house, Walter would spend the night listening out for any sounds he might make without sleeping at all. And the next day, after making a breakfast that nobody eats, Walter's left home alone when Junior leaves for school and Skyler just takes off for the day. And even though he's curious about where she's going, he decides to deal with that later and takes advantage of his alone time to visit the crawl space and have a conversation with Tuco, even bringing a plate of breakfast down as well as a bag full of tools. Get up, Tuco. I don't want you going belly up on me now. Walter says while shaking Tuco awake, and with his mouth taped up, Tuco would only be able to respond with muffled noises while he struggles in his bondage. And Walter says while eating a piece of bacon in front of him, I'm sure you're hungry, Tuco, but don't worry, the human body can go without food for a while. But in case it can't, that's why I brought this. And he reveals a feeding tube that's attached to a funnel, and while grabbing the back of Tuco's head, Walter would forcibly shove the tube up his nose so it can go down his throat. And if you've seen Your Honor Season 2 Episode 1, it's the exact same concept. But with Tuco basically mummified with tape, he wouldn't be able to do anything but squirm and struggle while it happens. And once the tube was in place, Walter pours a couple bottles of Ensure protein shakes into the funnel and feeding Tuco the only way he could. But that wouldn't be the end of his punishment, because Walter would then grab a pair of bolt cutters from his bag and he places it around Tuco's pinky toe, and he tells him, "Are you ready?" And while looking into his anger-filled eyes, Walter clamps down on the bolt cutters and severs his pinky toe. And again, all he can do is squirm while his screams are muffled by the tape. And as he kicks out his feet in pain, Walter is still not done with him as he pulls out a small blowtorch from his bag to cauterize the wound and stop the bleeding. But as much as Tuco struggles, it doesn't stop Walter for even a second, and he even starts to enjoy how he makes someone like Tuco cry out in pain. And while putting the blowtorch away, he tells him while rifling through his bag, "Don't worry, Tuco, I'm gonna give you a way out. Trust me," he says while pulling out a syringe that turns out to be horse tranquilizer, and he tells him while injecting him, "But for now, Tuco, you're gonna go to sleep for a while." And as Tuco's vision gets blurry, the last thing he would see is Walter pulling out an M16 rifle, and then everything goes black. But hours later, when Tuco awakens, his blurry vision focuses on Walter, who's been waiting for him to wake up. And with Skyler and Walter Jr. still mad at him, they chose to spend the weekend at Hank and Marie's and leaving Walter with the house all to himself for the next few days. And he says to Tuco, who now has a wire that's attached to his taped up hands that leads all the way to a rifle that's positioned just to the right of Walter, and he explains, "I'm glad you're awake, and I told you that I was going to give you a way out, and, well, here it is." Walter says while holding the bolt cutters, "All you have to do is pull that wire, and this will all be over. But until then," he says while snipping off another one of Tuco's toes, then burning the wound with a blowtorch, once again leaving Tuco in complete agony as he lets out muffled screams while sweat and tears drips from his face. And Walter leaves him in the crawl space with the hopes that Tuco would take care of himself before the weekend is over. But with each passing day, he starts to get worried when Tuco hasn't pulled the wire yet. And with his family coming back by the end of the night, when Walter visits the crawl space and he brings down a pillow to cover the barrel to have a makeshift silencer. And instead of taking a toe this time, Walter decides to take one of Tuco's legs and cutting all the way up to the knee. And despite the excruciating pain, Tuco refuses to give Walter the satisfaction of killing himself. And even after his leg's gone, although there's no getting used to the torture schedule, when seeing Walter grow frustrated with each visit, he gets a sense of joy knowing that he can still get under his skin despite him literally losing a pound of flesh. And when his family does eventually come back home, Walter surprisingly manages to keep a healthy balance between his nights with Tuco and his days with Skylar and Walter Jr. But after a week of this routine, when Walter has to go out for chemotherapy, he leaves the house for the first time in weeks. And with Junior in school right now, him and Skylar make their way over to the oncology center. And while Tuco sits in a crawl space now with no legs and a feeding tube hanging from his nose that's crusting over, he thinks about pulling the cord, not wanting to endure another day of this. And when he hears the front door of the house open, he starts to get ready for Walter's daily visit. But the person walking through the door would actually be Walter Jr., who came home early from school that day. And when going to fix himself a cup of water, when seeing the brown smelly liquid coming from the sink's tap, he takes it upon himself to see if he can fix the water heater. And he goes into the closet and starts hitting it with his crutches, but that doesn't work. And he opens up the crawl space to get a better look underneath. And to his surprise, he sees a taped up and bloody Tuco Salamanca curled up in the corner with no legs and barely alive. But in Junior's eyes, he sees an innocent man who needs help, and he goes into the kitchen to grab a cup of water. The first thing he does would be to take the gag off his mouth and give him something to drink. And when he puts the cup up to his lips, Tuco's eyes would flutter open. And when he looks at Walter Jr., he remembers seeing him in a picture in Walter's wallet, and he figures that he's looking at the son of Heisenverse right now. And as Junior tries to ask him questions like where did he come from or who is he, after Tuco swallows a mouthful of water for the first time in weeks, without saying a single word, he would yank the cord, causing the rifle to fire and riddling them both with bullets until the magazine is empty. And only minutes later, Walter and Skylar return home. But when seeing the closet door to the crawl space opened, Walter calls out for his son. Walter Jr.? But he makes a horrifying discovery when he looks into the crawl space and sees both Junior and Tuco covered in bullet holes and bleeding on each other. And he says, No, please no. Walter says in a panic as he cradles his son's life to his body. And watching from above will be Skylar, who screams out in terror and drops to her knees at the sight of her son, who's almost unrecognizable due to the amount of bullets he took. And Walter says in a saddened tone, Skylar, I can explain. But her cries only gets louder as she says, Oh God, Walt, what did you do? What did you do? And as she gets up and heads to the kitchen to grab the phone, Walter would get out of the crawl space and follow closely behind her. And as she dials for the police, Walter would snatch the phone out of her hand and causing a fight between the two. And in Walter's anger, he would push Skylar to the ground and having her fall on her pregnant stomach. And as he stands over his wife breathing heavily, Skylar looks up at him with fear in her eyes, not knowing what he'll do next. And she says while holding her stomach, Why would you do this? And when Walter sees the blood seeping from Skylar's dress, he wouldn't be able to handle what he's just done. And he runs over to Holly's nursery to grab the diaper box full of drug money. And before he leaves, he looks back at Skylar one last time, who's crying on the floor. And he just says, I'm sorry. And he shuts the door behind him. The gold Pontiac Aztek drives recklessly throughout the neighborhood until making it to the junkyard where Jesse kept the RV. And Walter, who's desperate to stay moving, approaches Badger's cousin with a couple $1,000s, and he not only pays for the repairs to the RV, but he also gives him another $1,000 to get rid of his car, which keeps him a few steps ahead of the police. And before handing over the keys, Walter gets the black fedora from the back seat, and he drives away in the rolling meth lab. But as he tries to remain calm while he waits at a red light, for the first time in hours, he's finally gotten a chance to look at himself in the mirror. And he tightly grips his steering wheel while he fights off the shame he's feeling for abandoning his family. And he can't believe how it all went so wrong so fast. And instead of blaming himself for taking his revenge to this extreme, he blames Tuco for not dying sooner. But interrupting his thoughts will be a squad of police cars with their sirens on and approaching him from the opposite direction. And he pulls over out of fear, thinking that they're after him. But when the cars pass him one by one, he feels a slight sense of relief. But that moment quickly fades when he thinks of where the police are going. And he figures that by now, the news of what happened at his home has spread like wildfire, which causes him to have flashbacks of the fight that he had with Skylar and also when he last seen Junior. Two things that are going to stay with him for the rest of his life, and it takes him everything in his power not to just quit right now and go back. But the rattling glass equipment in the RV reminds him of one certainty: he still has work to do. Because if he were to stop right now and just give himself up, everything that's happened would be all for nothing. Junior, Jesse, Skylar, all of it. And he's able to convince himself to keep cooking even after these atrocities, because at this point, that's all that he has now. So when the last squad car passes him and the light turns green, Walter continues to drive. But before going out to the desert to start another cook, Walter would drive to a local chicken restaurant to pick up some food for the night. A restaurant called Los Pollos Hermanos. And with the RV being too big for the drive-thru, he's forced to get out and order inside. And while walking towards the restaurant, he kneels down to pretend to tie his shoes to scan the area to make sure there's no cops nearby. And feeling that he's in the clear, he would get up to continue to walk inside. But unknown to Walter, one of the first people to find out about what happened to Tuco would be Mike, who right now is in the middle of having a conversation with Gus in the parking lot about that news in particular. And while explaining how Tuco was found in the crawl space of the white residence, both their attentions will be drawn towards a beat-down RV entering the parking lot. And when they see a disheveled-looking man getting out and approaching the restaurant, Mike continues to watch the man and would actually recognize him as Walter Hartwell White, someone that he was doing some recon on for Saul with the discovery of the blue meth. And he says like he can't believe his eyes. You know, the universe just has a way of working itself out. Because that man right there, the one that's pretending to tie his shoes, that's the one we're looking for. And he came right to us. And as Gus watches the man enter, he'd ask, "Are you sure?" To which Mike says, 100%. Meth cook, cancer patient, the whole 9 yards. And I'm guessing you'd like to have a conversation with him? And Gus would take a deep exhale, and before getting out the car, he slowly nods his head as he leaves to enter the restaurant. And while inside, Gus would present himself as a friendly restaurant owner to Walter as he takes his order, all while Mike would stealthily walk over to the RV and quickly switch out the gas cap for one with a tracker on it. And as Gus finishes up Walter's order, he'd ask, "Is there anything else I can do for you?" No, thank you," Walter says as he takes his order to go and leaves as quick as he came. And after doing one more look around with his shoe tying routine, he gets inside the RV and drives out to the desert unaware that he's being tracked. Hours later, Skylar awakens in a hospital room with the police at her door and Hank and Marie waiting at her bedside. And after the fall that she had during her fight with Walter, everything still feels like a blur to her and believing that it was all just a bad dream. But when she tries to move, she can feel that she's extremely weak, and Marie rushes to her side and urges her to be careful. And Skylar at first would ask Marie in a confusing tone, "Marie, what's going on here? What happened?" But when she puts her hand on her stomach, she would start to go into a panic saying, "Marie, what happened to my baby?" And similar to Walter, all the memories come flooding back to her. And while Marie tries to comfort Skylar, Hank would step in and ask, "Sky, I know this is a lot for you right now, but is there anything that you can tell me about what happened at the house? Anything? Like, where's Walt?" And Skylar wipes her tears saying, It was Walt. He... And that's all Skylar would be able to say before she breaks down again. And even though she didn't say much, it's more than enough for Hank to know that his brother-in-law needs to be brought in. Because him and Gomez was one of the first people on the scene when they found her, and the discovery they made in the crawl space with Tuco and Walter Jr. was enough to put the entire city on high alert thinking there's a psychopath in the area. But after what Skylar just told him, as hard as it is to believe, Hank is forced to put every available agent out on the lookout for Walter White, who is now considered to be armed and dangerous. And when Skylar does eventually calm down, she'd be a lot more cooperative with the police. But the more she tells them, they begin to pick her story apart and would begin to look at her as a potential suspect. Because how does someone manage to amputate a man's legs over a period of days without anyone noticing? And when the police questioning starts to get more and more aggressive, it overwhelms her, and given everything that she's been through, she would suddenly start to have a nervous breakdown, and all she'd be able to say is, "Shut up, shut up, shut up, shut up." We pick up in the middle of nowhere on the Tahajali Indian Reservation, and Walter's parked where it all began, and while setting up his workstation, he'd leave the keys on the counter to honor Jesse, and for the next few hours, he does nothing but cook. And he's temporarily able to push everything that happened to the back of his mind and just focus on the chemistry. And it'll be well past midnight when he starts the cooling process. But as he waits for the meth to harden, he would start to hear weird ruckus going on outside, which is odd because he's in the middle of nowhere. So when he looks through the window to see what's out there, he sees nothing for miles, and he imagines that it was just an animal that he heard. So as he continues to wait for the meth to cool, eventually, after the day that he's had, the exhaustion catches up with him, and he would doze off near a portable heater. And sitting a few miles away, while looking through a pair of binoculars, Mike, who's been watching the RV since leaving Los Pollos Hermanos, figures that by this time, it's a pretty good chance that Walter's asleep. But unaware if he has any weapons on him, Mike would slowly drive up with his lights off to maintain the element of surprise, and once he gets right outside the RV door, he pulls off a piece of tape that's covering a bullet hole, and he's able to peek through the hole and see Walter sleeping on the floor. And when the power in the RV dies, and the portable generator goes out, Mike is able to easily gain entry into the RV, and once inside, he completely binds Walter's arms and legs without him even waking up, and mirroring what he's done to Tuco. And once he was secure and Mike was positive that he wasn't going anywhere, he would make a call to Gus to tell him, "What do you want to do with him?" To which Gus responds saying, "I'm on my way." And for the next few hours, Mike sits inside the RV with an unconscious Walter White who has yet to discover the danger that he's in. Early the very next morning, Walter awakens to find a hood placed over his head, and when he tries to move his arms and legs, he realizes that he's tied up, causing him to freak out, and he says out loud, "Hello? What's going on?" as he tries to move, but his question is met with deafening silence. But he knows that he's not alone because he'd start to hear footsteps walking around him, and he again tries to get an answer saying, "Who's there? Why are you doing this? What do you want?" And suddenly, he's picked up and dragged out the RV, then finding himself on his knees in the hot desert sand, still with the hood over his head. And after a few minutes, he'd hear a car approaching him, and he begins to tremble in fear, not knowing what could happen next. But when the hood is snatched off his head, it causes him to be temporarily blind from the sunlight for a few seconds. But when his vision focuses back in, he sees a familiar looking man looking down at him, and he recognizes him as the same man who took his order from the chicken restaurant. And Walter begins to cough uncontrollably, which hides his fear for a moment, but he is beyond terrified as he finds himself in the same position as his former captive, and he assumes that these people might be related to Tuco in some way and are seeking revenge for what happened to him. But that thought goes away when the man in front of him finally breaks the silence by telling him, "First, please allow me to give you my deepest condolences for your son. I am truly sorry for this loss that you suffered. However, Mr. White, there is something that we have to discuss." Gus explains why he steps closer and continues to say, "I am told that Tuco Salamanca was found in your home in an agonizing state before he was killed. My question to you is, why?" And Walter looks at the men surrounding him before he nervously explains, "After what he put me and my partner through, a simple bullet to the head would have been too humane for someone like him." An answer that Gus would be intrigued by, with him sharing the same philosophy towards the Salamancas, and he would ask, "And can I assume that you also killed his uncle, a wheelchair-bound man with a bell on it?" "That was an accident," Walter says in defense. "The old man, he didn't deserve it." And Gus scoffs at him saying, "Similar to you, that man murdered someone that I cared about. And yes, he didn't deserve a bullet. He deserved much worse." And hearing that, it leaves Walter having no idea where he stands right now, and he would timidly ask, "So, what happens now?" To which Gus responds saying, "What would you like to happen?" I don't know. I'm not so sure anymore. All I wanted to do was to keep my family safe, and it seems I couldn't even do that." Walter responds with his eyes beginning to water, and when one of the men shows Gus the blue meth that Walter was cooking in the RV, instead of flat out killing him for being deprived of his revenge, he presents Walter with an offer saying, "You have a product that I am told is excellent, and given your current predicament, I can offer you safety in exchange for your talent to be used in a more fitting environment." And Walter can't believe what he's hearing, and he would need some clarification saying, "You want to offer me a job?" And Gus tells him while having Tyrus cut him loose, "What I'm offering, I think it would be better for you to see it for yourself." And Walter, who is now standing up face to face with Gus, tells him, "If you know what I've done, and what I lost, how could you trust me to do anything?" And Gus would pause for a moment to look Walter up and down, then he tells him, "You tortured a man for days, and it cost you your family, and instead of facing the police, you came out to the middle of the desert to cook. I know what I need to know about you, and I trust that you will be pleased with my offer." And that gets Walter more curious than scared, and he agrees to leave with Gus to check out this offer. And once back into town, once they arrive at the laundromat, Gus would escort Walter to the back area near a seemingly broken washing machine, and with the flip of a switch, he begins to watch the machine begin to tilt forward to reveal a state-of-the-art meth super lab built right underneath the laundromat. And as they start to walk down the stairs, Walter looks around in wonder at the lab's setup and is just amazed at seeing that something like this is even possible. And Gus would tell him once they're on the ground floor, "This is my offer to you. I need 200 pounds a week, and in exchange, I will ensure your safety." And while holding a piece of equipment, the joy of seeing such a spectacle disappears when he realizes that he's not really given much of a choice in the matter, and what he's being offered isn't really that different than what Tuco had in store for him. But considering the options between cooking meth professionally or taking his chances against the police alone, it's not that hard to see which option Walter goes with, and seeing no downside to this deal with it keeping him out of prison as well as serving as the ultimate distraction, he'd simply tell Gus, "When do I start?" It's been a week since the massacre at the White residence, and once Skylar was released from the hospital, you would think that given everything that she's been through, the public perception of her would be seen in a more favorable light. But instead, the media portrays her as one of the worst mothers of all time. And wanting to be there for her sister, Marie would want her to stay at her place for a while to get all the support she needs, but she declines and just wants to be left alone. Because she hasn't had the chance to properly grieve since waking up in the hospital, and since then, it's only been her trying to prove her innocence to the police, who are convinced that she had something to do with it. So when she finally does make it home, the smell of gunpowder and blood permeates the air, even after a week. And she tears down the caution tape blocking out the crawl space, and she looks down at the blood-stained floor inside. and unable to hold back the emotions any longer, she begins to sob uncontrollably while walking throughout the house, and she spends the next 2 days crying herself to sleep and smoking cigarettes throughout the day just to keep her nerves in check. Because she can't believe that her husband was too much of a coward to take accountability for his own actions, and he just left her to deal with this by herself. And with the recent miscarriage that she suffered, Skylar goes into a deep depression, unable to leave the house for days. And one night, when she looks outside to see a police car watching her house, something inside of her snaps, and she calmly goes into her room and slightly closes the door behind her. And while focusing on the door, we would just hear a choking sound for minutes before it goes completely silent in the house. But when the next day comes, Marie stops by for a usual checkup on Skylar, but when she knocks on the door, there's no answer. And she sees that her car is in the driveway, so she knows that she's home. So Marie continues to knock on the door thinking that Skylar's just asleep. But after nearly 30 minutes and still no answer, Marie gets worried and calls Hank to see if they can get into the house. And within 5 minutes, Hank arrives with a few other police officers and they easily gain entry into the home. And once inside, Marie calls out for Skylar, but there's still no answer. And she goes around the house checking every room to see where she is. And when checking the master bedroom, they make a horrific discovery when seeing that Skylar hung herself in the bathroom, causing Marie to let out a bone-chilling scream that echoes throughout the house. And Hank is even speechless from so many tragedies happening to his family in such a short amount of time. But it gives him a sense of purpose to find Walter because he has single-handedly destroyed his family and is still out there. And in Jesse's words,
You can't keep getting away with it! You can't keep getting away with it!
So while Hank and a few other officers are calling in a coroner, just down the block will be Tyrus, who's been watching Skylar for the past few days under Gus's orders. And he pulls out his phone to make a call and he says, "There's something you need to know about." Over at the lab, Walter's been cooking non-stop ever since accepting Gus's offer, and he even prefers sleeping there between cooks. And with every batch coming out more pure than the last, he exceeds everyone's expectations with his work ethic. But worried about burnout, Gus would send him an assistant to pick up some of the slack and also learn his formula. So while in the middle of taking a nap, the sound of a door opening wakes him up, and when he goes to check out who it is, he'd be introduced to a fellow chemist named Gail Bedecker, who is actually the person who designed the lab. And during their first cook together, Walter hasn't had this much fun since back in the days at Gray Matter, because Gail is somebody who just gets the chemistry, and the more they work together, their actions become nearly synchronized, and they become a far better duo than him and Jesse ever could. But once Gail leaves for the night, and Walter is alone again, tonight just feels different, and he finds it hard to fall asleep. And he's tempted to use the emergency phone to call Skylar to just say that he's sorry, unknown to him that she's already dead. So as he goes to grab the phone to make the call, the phone will start to ring before he can even dial. And he picks up only to hear Gus's voice on the other line, and he tells him, "I know that you miss your wife, but unfortunately, I cannot allow you to make that call as it could put our entire operation at risk." And considering all that Gus has done for him, Walter wouldn't make a big deal about not talking to Skylar, and he apologizes for his negligence. But Gus would end the call on a high note saying, "But I am not unsympathetic to your issue, Mr. White, and I believe I can provide you with a satisfactory solution." And before Walter can get him to elaborate, the call ends, giving him a glimmer of hope that he'll see Skylar again, because if anybody can arrange it, it'll be Gus. And he goes to bed the same way he does every other night, with him hoping and praying that when he wakes up, this will all just be a dream. And while he sleeps, Gus watches the cameras to make sure that Walter stays put. But knowing that he'll eventually want to see his wife again, Gus would start to put his own plan into motion to get rid of Walter. Because as great as an asset as he is to the organization, he's also one of the biggest liabilities. And the last thing that he needs is another Warner Ziegler situation. So as Gus looks at the newspaper detailing Skylar's death, he thinks about the Salamancas who, after finding out what Walter did to Hector and Tuco, has been just as relentless as the police about finding him. And then he remembers the DEA agent who turned out to be his brother-in-law, who no doubt is looking for him as well. And Gus would take all these elements and put them together to create a formula of his own that takes out the Salamancas, Walter, and the DEA. The next day comes and Gail and Walter are back at it with another batch. But today, something feels off about Walter, and Gail would want him to take it easy and he would finish the cook himself. And when they're finished, Walter starts to open up about his personal life, and for the first time since meeting Gus, he tells a story about what happened with Tuco, Jesse, and his family. A story that makes Gail tear up after hearing all the bloody details. But their heart-to-heart will be interrupted by Mike, who says from the top railing, "Walter, if you could do me a favor and come with me, please." And he looks up to respond saying, What's this about?" But Mike gives him a death stare before saying, "I'll be in the car. Don't take all day." Then walking out the lab. And Gail and Walter share a meaningful look before he goes upstairs to follow Mike. And while out on the road, Mike tells him, "Alright, Walt, so our employer managed to set up a safe house for you to say what you need to say to your wife, who should be there in 30 minutes. Do you have any questions?" Mike says while checking his watch. And Walter looks at Mike with a confused look and says, "But I thought Gus couldn't." "Let me tell you something, Walter. There's no such thing as can't in this line of business, okay?" Mike says, cutting him off while he continues to drive. And after a few minutes, they pull into an alleyway where Mike tells him, "There you go, Walter. I'll be back in an hour to come and get you." And as he gets out the car and climbs through the backyard fence, Mike slowly drives away and he makes a phone call to Gus telling him, "I just dropped him off." And Gus tells him, "Get Agent Trader to that location. I'll get the Salamancas." We pick up in a parking lot of a shopping center where Hank has just gotten a few things from Marie, and as he gets inside the car, he receives a phone call from someone with a modulated voice telling him that Walter White has been found. And before Hank can respond, the phone call ends, then a text message with a location comes through. And with no way to call the number back, and no further leads on Walter, Hank takes the chance and drives over to that location, but he holds off on calling for backup to at least have a conversation with his brother-in-law to know why he did what he did. So while making his way over to the location, on the other side of town, the Salamanca twins are literally in the middle of a firefight with a rival gang. But when Marco receives a text message from Gus with an address and a caption reading, "Blood for Blood," the two brothers quickly finish up what they're doing and they drive as fast as they can to the location and get their revenge. And as the two parties start to converge on the location, Walter sits alone in a safe house counting the minutes until he can see his wife. But while pacing around the empty house, he finds a fairly recent newspaper on the ground, and he wouldn't even need to get past the first page to find out what happened to Skylar. And his hands tremble while holding the newspaper as he finally starts to take accountability for what happened, and he blames himself for the way things turned out, but he's just too late. And he also starts to wonder why Gus sent him there if he knew Skylar was dead already, and the only rational conclusion he can come up with is Gus set him up. And at that very moment, he would hear the sound of a car door slam, and he peeks out the curtains to see who it is, and when he sees two men approaching the door carrying an axe, Walter quickly climbs out the window and jumps the fence, just narrowly escaping the Salamanca twins. And as the men slowly enter the house, they start to walk throughout the rooms looking for their target, but when seeing the window open, they imagine that they just missed them, and they would start to walk back to their car. But on their way out, that's when they run into Hank Schrader, who just pulled up to the location. And while still inside his car, when seeing the Salamanca twins carrying an axe, he'd identify himself as a DEA and telling them to put it down. But the two men would go on the offensive and open fire on Hank, shattering his window and causing him to duck down in his car. And as the two men approach, they would notice that Hank has gotten out through the back passenger door and giving him a slight edge as he comes around and drops one of the Salamanca twins where he stands. But while Hank's back was turned, Lionel would come up from behind him with the axe, and he comes down on his shoulder, causing him to drop the gun and fall to the floor. And before he can even regain his bearings, Hank will be hacked to pieces by the axe, reducing him to nothing more than a pile of blood and dismembered limbs. Lionel then walks up to his brother, who tells him to finish this, and with his last breath saying in Spanish, "Blood for blood." And not even 2 houses away, while hiding behind a neighbor's shed, Walter holds back his emotions after seeing what happened to Hank. And he even contemplates on giving himself up because he knows that he's in over his head. But knowing the connections that Gus has, who knows if he's even safe behind bars. So with him already having 2 different death warrants, one from cancer and the other from Gus, Walter decides that if he's gonna die anyway, he's gonna take everyone that he can with him. Because at this point, what else could he lose? It's been 3 months since the failed assassination attempt on Walter White's life, and since then, he seemingly disappeared. And with many believing that he died from the cancer months ago, Gus wouldn't be able to relax until that was confirmed and the bodies turned up. Because although there's not much that Walter can do that can have an impact on his organization, Gus is just not the type of person to leave loose ends hanging around. But if things couldn't get any worse for him, the cartel's been waiting for an explanation in regards to the order that he gave that got one of the Salamanca twins killed. And the longer that he goes without answering, the more they disrupt his business, either from terrorizing the customers at Los Pollos Hermanos or killing the drivers on the road delivering the products. And after a while, it becomes hard for Gus to ignore. So instead of splitting his attention between the cartel and Walter, he makes the cartel his top priority. And in the hopes of putting an end to this, Gus will have a sit-down conversation with Gav, the top enforcer for Don Eladio. And he tells Gus that in order for him to do right by the cartel, they're going to need the chemist that's been cooking the blue meth, which right now has been Gale for the past few months, who's come the closest to replicating Walter's formula. But Gus, not wanting to give up his greatest asset, would instead train someone in Gale's place to go down to Mexico to cook. And the only disposable person that he has that he can trust with a job this big would be Victor. So for the next 2 weeks, Gale and Victor work together to get his cooking standards at least up to 90%. But for Gale, he remembers that when he first came, shortly afterwards, Walter disappeared. And now Gus has him doing the same thing, which has him worried that he might disappear as well. But he keeps his suspicions to himself. And once Gus was confident in Victor's cooks, he as well as Mike and Tyrus would leave to Mexico to meet with the cartel and leaving a handful of guys to look out for Walter. We pick up at a cemetery where Marie's being accompanied by Steve Gomez to bring flowers to the gravestones of Hank, Skylar, and Walter Jr., something she's been doing every week since Hank died. And while they pay their respects, a bearded gravedigger watches them from afar and doing his best to stay hidden. A man we come to find out is actually Walter White. And after getting away from the Salamancas, he went back to the junkyard to see if Badger's cousin can help him out again. But with him not even having a dollar to his name, he begs him for a place to lay low, and in exchange, he'll work for free to do anything. And luckily for Walter, when he gave him the extra money to get rid of his car a few months back, it earned him a favor, and Badger's cousin was able to get him a job at the same cemetery where his family was buried at. And the best part about this whole setup is that the owner would ask no questions and he pays in cash. But $100 a day is barely enough for him to survive off of, and it would seem like pennies in compared to what he was making only a few months ago. But regardless, he doesn't plan on being there long, and the moment he gets situated at his new place to stay, he wouldn't waste any time working on a plan on how he's going to get to Gus. And every day, after his literal grave shift, he spends his time watching all the places he knows Gus to be, looking for any weaknesses that he can exploit. But days of watching turns into weeks, and no matter where he looks, he just can't seem to catch Gus alone. From the laundromat to Los Poros Hermanos, he's always got Victor, Tyrus, or Mike with him at all times, making it impossible for him to get close. And after going months without his treatment, the cancer's been eating him from the inside out and having him wither away as the days pass. And with him not knowing how much longer he can go on, Walter starts to doubt himself that he can even pull this off, and bringing him to where he is right now, a man who's almost unrecognizable as the once loving husband and father. But anytime Marie stops by the cemetery, those are always the hardest days for him, because he'd like to think that she would still see him at the same Walter that she's come to call her brother-in-law, but he knows that's just a fantasy. And she, like the rest of the world, either thinks that he's dead or wants him to be, and he can't blame anyone for feeling that way. And at his lowest point, he even considers taking his own life, because if he can't get to Gus, then what's the point? And he decides that he wants to spend his last few moments around something familiar. But when he gets to his house, he's overcome with grief when seeing the true aftermath of his actions, because the place that he once laid his head for years is now just a fenced-off piece of abandoned property. And he whispers to himself while closing the car door, "I'm so sorry, Junior. I'm sorry, Skylar. I should have been there for you too. I should have put you first. I'm so sorry I didn't." And after getting a crowbar to pry open the door that's been boarded shut, he reminisces while he walks through the hall of his former home. But when he hears what sounds like a group of kids in the backyard, he goes to look outside through the window. But instead of kids, he sees a bunch of meth heads that's smoking the blue meth in his backyard right inside the now drained pool. And bearing witness that the blue meth is still out there, the desire for revenge is reignited within him. Because there's only one other person on Earth that can cook the blue sky, and seeing something that he created get taken and passed off as someone else's reminds him of all those years ago at Grey Matter, and how Gretchen and Elliot took a company that was supposed to be his, and now here's history repeating itself. And with his wedding ring around his neck serving as a reminder of what he lost, Walter leaves the house with a restored sense of purpose and vows to do whatever it takes to destroy Gus's empire, even if it's the last thing he does. When Gus and his men arrive in Mexico, he presents Victor to the cartel chemist, and for the next few hours, Victor follows all the steps taught to him by Gail and finishes off with a batch that gets up to 91%, which would be considered low in the eyes of cooks like Walter or Jesse, but is easily better than anything that cartel could come up with. And once satisfied, they're brought out to the pool at Don Eladio's compound, and while they wait, Gus says to Victor, who's standing by his side, "Just remember the plan." And Victor slowly nods in response. And moments later, the cartel comes out surrounding Gus, Mike, Victor, and Tyrus, and amongst the cartel members would be the last of the Salamanca bloodline, Leonel and Joaquin Salamanca, who are still angry at Gus for giving the order that got Marco killed. But after a brief stare down, Eladio calls Gus over and they hug, breaking the tension in the air. But while Eladio would seem to be happy to see him, Gus would be all business, and he introduces Victor to the cartel as a way to bury the hatchet, and he presents him with a bottle of Zafiro Añejo to sweeten the deal. And Eladio is beyond excited when he sees the bottle, and he gives everyone a shot, with the only ones refusing being the Salamancas. But when offering one to Victor, Gus tells Eladio, "Don, I do not recommend him drinking. This one has only one kidney." And wanting to protect his newest asset, Eladio takes the shot back and gives it to Gus. And after a group salud, they get the real party started.
Salud.
And after mingling with Eladio, Gus requests to use the restroom, but in a matter of seconds, bodies would start to drop left and right, and the first person to take notice would be Leonel, and he begins to slowly arm himself with a pistol, and when he catches Mike going after Gaff getting ready to strangle him, he takes aim getting ready to shoot. But before he can get a shot off, both Victor and Tyrus open fire on him and kill him the deadliest of the Salamancas, and his body, along with Don Eladio's, would fall into the pool, turning the water from an ocean blue to a blood red. But Gus's victory would be cut short when he collapses from ingesting the poison tequila, and Tyrus and Victor carry him over to a car that still has keys, and while everyone is getting in the car, they're attacked by the final Salamanca, Joaquin, and he opens fire on them and hitting Tyrus in the chest, but Mike returns fire and kills him with a headshot. Then the four of them leave the compound and head towards Gus's doctor. Back over in Albuquerque, Walter's been doing some recon at the laundromat and the Los Pollos Hermanos restaurant for the past few days, and he noticed that Gus wasn't at either of these locations for quite some time, which gave him the opportunity to explore a different weakness, because if he can't get to Gus, he can get the next best thing, his lab. But there's only one other person that he knows that can help him gain access inside, and that would be his former assistant, Gail Bedecker. And after a few days of tailing, Walter manages to find out where he lives. But he's conflicted about going to talk to him, because even though they become close during their time together at the lab, at this point, he doesn't know where Gail's loyalties lie, and he dreads what he'll have to do if he sides with Gus, but it's either this or nothing. So for the next few hours, Walter parks outside the apartment building and he watches through a pair of binoculars before going inside. And when he sees that the area is clear and none of Gus's men are watching Gail, he nervously walks to the apartment. And once he was standing in front of the door, he knocks, hoping in the back of his mind that Gail doesn't answer. But when he hears the music inside turn off and the doorknob begins to turn, he prepares for his reaction. And when Gail sees Walter, he looks at him like he just seen a ghost. But Gail, being the kind of person that he is, will go in to hug Walter and is just happy to see that his once good friend is still alive. And he invites him into his apartment where Gail's boiling water to make tea, and he offers Walter some, to which he accepts. And while they wait, him and Gail catch up with him asking so many questions to Walter, saying, "Wow, just wow. Where have you been this whole time? They told me that you were dead. What happened to you?" And Walter, not wanting to show his cards just yet, would ask him, "What did they tell you exactly?" "Well, after you left, the next day when I got to the lab and you weren't there, Mr. Frink came down and told me about a shooting that happened, and I heard about your wife, and I'm sorry." Gail explains, "Thank you, Gail. I appreciate that. And where's Gus now?" Walter questions. "I'm not too sure, but him, Mike, and the other two scary guys went on a trip, but should be coming back by now. And when they hear that you're back and okay, we can actually get you back in the lab and it can be like old times." "Oh, the tea's ready," Gail says with optimism as he goes into the kitchen to get the tea. And Walter, who can't afford to give up his element of surprise, knows what he has to do to keep Gail quiet. And with his back turned while he's in the kitchen pouring the hot tea, he spots a knife on the countertop and he slowly walks over to Gail and he tells him how he likes his tea while he also grabs the knife. But he hesitates when he catches a glimpse of himself in the reflection of the blade. But when Gail turns around holding the 2 cups of tea, he says to him, "So speaking of Gus, I was suspecting that he was actually trying to..." But he's cut off when Walter stabs him in the chest and causing him to drop the tea and shattering the cups on the ground. Gail would then look down at the blade in his chest with complete surprise, then back up at Walter, who's just saying over and over, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." And he would collapse to the ground gasping for air, unable to say a word, and he just continues to stare at Walter as the life leaves his eyes. And he apologizes one more time, saying, "I wish things could have been different, Gail." And he wipes his tears before getting the keys out of Gail's pockets. But on his way out the door, he'd hear a phone ring, and when he picks up to check the caller ID, he sees that Gus is calling and putting him at a sense of urgency. Because even though he knows that Gus is out of town, he doesn't know when he'll be back. But with him literally holding the keys to Gus's empire, Walter leaves the apartment, and on his way over to the lab, he makes a stop at the cemetery to say his goodbyes to his family. Back over in Mexico, after leaving Tyrus with the doctor to treat his injuries, Mike, Victor, and Gus made their way back into town. And knowing that he'll have the entire city to himself with no one to answer to, just for a moment, he believes he has nothing to worry about. But when he calls Gail to let him know of their return, and he doesn't answer, immediately paranoia gets to Gus and his mind goes right to Walter White. And just like his suspicion with Lalo Salamanca over 6 years ago, he has that same feeling. But this time around, he tells Mike about the hunch that he has and gives Victor an order saying, "When we get back into town, I need you to stop by Gail's apartment." "I can do that, but why?" Victor questions. And Gus explains while looking out the car window, "For the same reason that me and Mike will be stopping by the lab." Over at the cemetery, Walter White stands in front of the gravestones of Skylar and Walter Jr., and while dusting off some leaves, he drops down and begs them for forgiveness and tells them, "I know I can never make things right with you guys, and I can't ever say sorry enough, but I started this, and I'm gonna put an end to it. All of it. And I'll see you soon." He then began to cough uncontrollably, and when he sees the blood in his palm, he knows that he doesn't have that much time left. So after his final goodbyes, he gets up and starts walking back to his car. But when he passes Hank's gravestone, he wouldn't be able to look in that direction with the memory of his death being so fresh in his mind, and he purposely looks down at the ground to avoid eye contact. But while he continues to walk, with him not looking ahead of him, he'd accidentally bump shoulders with a woman who's walking opposite to him. And we find out that it was actually Marie, who was there for her usual visits. And when she gets a look at the man, he looks eerily similar to her ex-brother-in-law that she's sworn had died months ago. And even if there's a 1% chance that it's actually him, she takes it as an absolute certainty. Because after everything that happened with Walter Jr. and Skylar, she's never gotten closure for their deaths. But now, she can be the one to finally get them justice. So while she gets into her car to follow Walter, she makes a call to Steve Gomez to tell him of her discovery. We pick up at the laundromat where Walter was able to just walk in. And once he reached the back area where the broken washing machines are, he presses a button on one of them and it begins to tilt forward, allowing for him to enter. And with Gail's keys, he's once again back inside the meth super lab. But Walter wouldn't know that Marie followed him and she snuck in right behind him. And when she sees the washing machine reveal some kind of underground pathway, she's back on the phone calling Steve Gomez and says in a whispered tone, "Steve, how far away are you?" And he says while driving, "About 5 minutes. Do you still have eyes on Walt?" "Yeah, but things are getting weird. I think there's some kind of underground hideout underneath the laundromat," Marie says, trying to stay hidden. "A hideout? Okay, just stay put and I'll be there soon," Gomez says in a reassuring tone. But things for Marie only get crazier when she spots Gus Fring, the owner of Los Pollos Hermanos, enter the laundromat, and he goes to the same washing machine that Walter did and would also enter through this underground pathway, and she just tells Gomez while getting increasingly nervous, "Please hurry." Then back inside the lab, Walter begins to rig the lab for a fire, but in his weakened state, he moves a lot slower and is only able to tip over a couple barrels of methylamine, but that should be more than enough to burn the lab down. And choosing not to wear a respirator, he ends up coughing up more blood, but he keeps going. And the last piece of the puzzle would be for him to plant some exposed wires on the ground to ignite the methylamine. But when he hears the sound of an elevator shaft opening, it stops him in his tracks, but Walter makes no attempt to hide. And when the gates open, he'd be looking at Mike with a pistol drawn, who says, "What are you doing here, Walter?" And he says in a fearless tone, "I'm taking back what's mine. Gus, he had no right to use my formula." And then the door from the top railing opens and echoes throughout the lab, showing that Gus has arrived. And he walks towards the railing and says, "Mr. White, do you think doing this will atone you for all that you have done?" Leaving Walter in a trembling silence because in some way, he knows that Gus is right, and he continues to speak while walking down the stairs. "Or perhaps you believe that this will bring your family back in some way." And Gus, who is now face to face with Walter, awaits for a response. And Walter glances down at the wires on the ground, then back at Gus and says, "I'm not doing this for my family. I'm doing this for me." And he coughs up more blood and tells him, "So what? Are you gonna kill me now?" And Gus stares back at Walter before giving a glancing nod to Mike. And seconds later, just above the meth lab, a gunshot will be heard by the police, who are all trying to figure out how to get down there. But Marie would step forward and press the same button on the panel that she's seen Walter use, and they would witness the washing machine begin to tilt forward and revealing a ladder shaft leading to the lab. And Steve Gomez would lead the charge going down the ladder first, with the other officers following behind him. Then back inside the lab, Walter lies on the ground bleeding out from a gunshot fired by Mike, but he notices that he's only inches away from the exposed wires. And as Gus and Mike stand over Walter looking down at him, all he can do is just wait for death. But before Mike can squeeze the trigger to put him out of his misery, suddenly the police would barge into the lab from the top floor, aiming their guns at him. "Police, put the gun down, now!" Gomez says to Mike, and with no other choice, both him and Gus would have to surrender, and he puts the gun down. But while nobody was paying attention to Walter, with the last little bit of strength that he has, he pushes the live wires onto the methylamine that's all over the floor, and with one little spark, the entire laboratory goes up in flames, and giving the officers barely enough time to get out before the lab explodes. And when the smoke clears, all that remains of the once great meth empire is just 3 charred corpses and an $8 million hole in the ground serving as their grave. And for the next few weeks, the fallout of Gus Fring being outed as a drug dealer who was also working with Walter White leads to police not knowing how to address it. And as far as Marie, we find her still dropping off flowers at the cemetery. And where there was once anger and pain has since been replaced with peace and acceptance, because now she can finally move on knowing that she was able to stop Walter and get justice for her family. And once she leaves the cemetery, she gets back into her car. And with her bags already packed, she decides to leave town and finally start a new chapter in her life. Hey everybody, and thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed another story from the Heisenverse and a conclusion to the Lost Tapes series, which in my opinion has to be the perfect alternate timeline to Breaking Bad, because it has all the same elements but just a different recipe. And in all honesty, I don't think I could have expanded the story the way I have without the support from you guys. So I would just like to say thank you to everyone who's been supporting the channel, some since day one. You know who you are. But I cannot express to you how much it means that people from all over the world still wants more Breaking Bad, and I'm just honored to be the person to deliver. So thank you to the 31,000 subs, and here's to 100k in 2024. But now I want to hear from you guys. What do you think of this story? Did you like it? Was it worth the wait? And could you have foreseen the ending? Whatever it is, let me know down below in the comments, and I'll do my best to respond. Until then, my name is Merge. Later.